Hi, it's Dr. N here with another lesson in the Unique Wellness Lifestyle series. Today we're going to talk about the mental game or the psychological aspect of getting better. And today we're going to just touch briefly on a couple of issues. One is how your mindset is a key factor in getting better. I want to introduce a term which is psychoneuroimmunology. This is actually one of the richest fields of research in the medical world right now. Basically, it has to do with how you think and how your mind has such a profound impact on your brain and on your immune system. And it's so profound that if you're sitting home feeling bad about feeling bad, that is probably one of the biggest obstacles that we have to try to overcome. And again, simply because how you think has an impact on the inflammatory state in your body and how your brain works. And so in some cases, one of the best things you can do is to force yourself to get up and get involved. And one of the easiest ways to feel good about yourself is to help other people. And so it's not uncommon for us to recommend people get involved in social groups or even sometimes in volunteering. Because again, the ability to reach outside of yourself can have a profound impact on how you feel about yourself, and that can have an impact on how your brain and your body works. So we're going to touch on that. We're going to talk about creating awareness of the process of getting better, and we're going to take a moment just to reinforce some expectations. And as always, we're going to boil this down to four core issues, and that is patience and process. We're going to talk about persistence. We're going to talk about letting out your inner private eye, and talk about the many phases of progress and teach you how to recognize whether or not you actually are getting better, because sometimes it's not quite so obvious. So we'll start with patience and process. And the first thing is to understand that getting better is a marathon and it's not a sprint. I would say the vast majority of my clients have some fairly complex problems in not only one issue, but they have multiple issues that are all intertwined and perpetuating each other. And it takes time to unravel that. And it would be, I guess, an easy analogy would be how quickly it is to untie a shoelace that has no knots in it versus trying to untie a shoelace that has not one knot, but that knot has other knots and there are multiple knots. You have to try to get them out in sequence and spend a lot of time tweaking and pulling and tugging before you actually can take your shoes off. So the other thing to think about from this is that when we look at the time frame of your program, whether that's a 4-month or a 6-month, it could be shorter, it could be a little bit longer, we don't really expect complex cases to fully resolve in that period of time. And I say fully resolve because in most cases we have significant progress. But if you remember back to the orientation, we talked about how at the end of anyone's program, we always have some things to do. It's either just some cleanup and tweaking, or sometimes we commit to a shorter program than actually we really require. And so there are still some significant work to be done. But as I've said before, we want to make sure that we're teaching you how to take care of yourself. But as we go through this process, and you're the one that ends up having to do all the work, some of the changes involve unlearning old habits and developing new ones. And that's a time-dependent process. And you may have heard it said before that it takes about 18 days of consistent work to create new habits, but you're working against the tension of how you used to do things, pulling against you and trying to get you back into habits and patterns that perhaps are not serving you the way that you want. Socrates said that the secret to change is to focus all of your effort not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And so I'm going to encourage you from a mindset standpoint to really be willing to let go of how you used to do things, how you used to think about things. There may be some things that are, you might consider your favorites, whether it's foods or activities that just aren't working for you. And I want you to be willing and open to the fact that, again, you may have to replace those. Now, ideally, we replace them with better alternatives. And so as you go through the process of change, it can be a little bit uncomfortable, but you have to stick to it and be persistent through that, which we'll come to in a moment, because really on the other side of that process of change is where all the good stuff happens. So we can't really expect 100% improvement at the end of the program, but you really should be well on your way. And even more than that, you should be equipped to continue to improve on your own. And so the discussions that we have in our one-on-one sessions and the things that we're going to share you through this the video lessons and handouts and PDFs that you can download should be equipping you to make sure that you take care of yourself, particularly as we learn what your core metabolic issues are. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat. If at any point during your program you feel like you're not getting it, I'm going to take responsibility for that, and I want you to let me know that we might need to spend a little bit more time talking about whatever it is that you're confused about, whether it's how do I control my blood sugar, or where's all this inflammation coming from, or what's the core problem that's causing my brain fog. I don't really care what it is. If you're feeling unequipped or uneducated, I need to know that so we can fill those gaps in. And it's very interesting that when we work with our clients, we try to be very clear about this concept here, is that you're the healer, not me. Even though physicians are considered to be healers, we're not really healers. I can't fix you. Only you can fix yourself. And we have to be able to harness the innate intelligence of your body, the things that keeps your heart beating, your blood flowing, and your cells alive. That innate intelligence is actually what heals you. So that's your job. My job is to educate you, to clarify questions, to point you in the right direction, to be your clinician, your diagnostician, your coach, your mentor, your encourager, but you ultimately have to do all the work. And in keeping with that, I want to bring your mind back to what we talked about in the orientation about these response patterns. Sometimes you feel like things aren't working because you make some progress and then you lose some ground. Well, that's to be expected. In fact, I would tell all of my clients, expect to have flare-ups. Even after we have done all of our good work and taught you what you need to do to take care of yourself, we still tell people, depending on their circumstance, that they can expect some flare-ups along the way. It's just part of the process. And if you have any problems that are either genetically driven or they've been in your system for so long that your system has kind of learned to be that way, then we can expect some flare-ups to happen. Some people flare up a little more frequently, some quite a bit less, but that's an individual response, which of course we can't cover in a general video like this. But along that side, as we talk about these flare-ups, we have to remember it is the nature of the beast. Most of my clients come to me with these multiple complex issues. A lot of them have autoimmune issues. A lot of them have had brain injuries or concussions. Some have both of those. And so it's kind of an accepted thing that there are going to be flare-ups. But whether you have flare-ups in the long run or not, we don't yet know until we get there. But certainly as you go through the process of change and growing and controlling your physiology, we would expect things to slip from time to time. So I don't want you to get discouraged. And here's one way to shift your mindset. When you get flared up, it's not a failure, it's feedback. Every time something happens and we get a negative consequence, whether it's a cyclical time-based thing. Some of our clients, our lady clients, flare up when they have their menstrual cycle. Or maybe it's a dietary thing. Maybe it's a slip up or an accidental exposure. Or maybe it's a reaction to a supplement we might ask you to take as a trial. Reality is that whatever happens, whether it's good or bad, it's feedback from your body that can help us figure out what to do. And the more things that we can figure out how they work for the good or for the worse, the better off we can tailor your protocol as we go through the process. So what I want to do is I want you to think about yourself as a private detective. This is where we talk about letting out your inner Sherlock or your Magnum PI, because you really need to start looking for clues as to not only how your body's working, but how it's reacting to things. Now, in the role of your private investigator and your inner Sherlock, so to speak, we want to understand what these common triggers are. And I know that I've shown these to you before, but I want to show them to you again because certain things we have to go over multiple times for them to stick. So the most common triggers are certainly going to be foods. There are going to be intentional and unintentional exposures, and sometimes there's even the accidentally on purpose exposure. The joke, I'm sure you've probably heard me say it, or you may have read it in one of the articles I've written. I tripped and the donut just landed in my mouth. Sometimes we don't want to take ownership of the things that we do to ourselves, but that is just the reality, and it's fairly common. Food's a very common trigger. Stress and illnesses. So if you're dealing with, for example, let's say you're an accountant and it's tax time, or your job has a certain cyclical variation to it. We see this quite a lot with our professors and our clients that are teachers, that during the summer, man, they're great. They feel fantastic. But a few months into the school year, when they start getting into evaluations and parent-teacher conferences, sometimes things crash because that's an added layer of stress that they don't have to deal with. And bringing in this concept of psychoneuroimmunology, if you've got something going on in your life, whether it's in the personal side of your life or whether it's in the professional side, if you've got something that's coming on the horizon and it's not something you're looking forward to, You can create a lot of the problems that you're trying to avoid just by focusing on the uh-oh, here it comes factor. Now, I don't know what your circumstance is or if you're dealing with those things. We can certainly talk about those in our one-on-ones. But I want you to be aware that the more you think about, the more you ruminate on the potential stressors and how bad something's going to be, the more likely it is it's going to happen that way. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, and it's not my skill set to kind of coach you through that. But I would encourage you, if that you have those things going on, again, whether it's personal, relationship, whether it's work and career related, there are people out there that are very well trained in giving you the skill sets and the life skills to be able to look at those things and put things in place to how you handle them or how you avoid them or whatever to make sure that they don't have that impact. So I just want you to be aware that how you think about things and what you dwell on does have a significant impact on how your body and your brain are working. Certainly your general workload can be a trigger. And this is something we find with our clients who get early success, meaning that right out of the gate they start feeling better. They kind of think, oh, well, okay, I'm back on track now. I can start doing more stuff. And at that point, they're doing more stuff. And while they're symptomatically better at the beginning, we haven't built a metabolic foundation for them to really work from, to be stable. Their safety net isn't put together yet. And so if you jump the gun too early and you start doing more stuff at home or at your work or perhaps in the gym, and that's another lesson talking about the exercise program and how we need to incorporate that in your particular case. But just be aware that your general workload can have an impact, and it can cause a flare-up, either because you commit to a really big project that just takes a lot of effort at a short period of time, or sometimes it's the accumulation of smaller things. Just be aware of that balance between what you can do and what you can recover from. And that brings me to the concept of the metabolic tipping point. And again, at this point, you probably have already heard about it, but the metabolic tipping point is basically that point at which the cost of your activities and all of your demands on your body go past your recovery capacity. And we'll see it very specifically with physical activity and exercise, but it doesn't mean it doesn't apply to life in general, because you can just be really busy with life, especially if you have large families or young families, or you're juggling a lot of different roles or priorities. Even just daily routine things in the absence of an exercise program can go past your metabolic tipping point, particularly if your metabolic tipping point is very low because your metabolic state isn't healthy. So these are most of your variables, and really ultimately what we want is we want the mindset of flare-ups are feedback, not failures, and there's a lesson. And that's why I use this analogy of being a private investigator or showing your inner Sherlock, is because you have to look at this as a puzzle to solve. What can I do and get away with? What can I not do right now because it has a consequence? And what can I do and modify and change in such a way that I can keep doing it, but it doesn't cost me the way that it has up until this point? And this is ultimately part of your job in this process and in this partnership, because you're with you 24/7, and you and I get a chance to talk only periodically. Now, when it comes to the triggers, they're not always obvious. So I want to give you a short list of things to think about, because what I don't want is I don't want you to be flared up and sit back and go, okay, I can't figure this out and I don't even know what it is, so I may as well give up. So one of the big, not so obvious triggers is seasonal changes. And this is very true, particularly for people who don't have like a real strong history of, say, hay fever or allergies. They're not on allergy medications. They don't get a runny nose or itchy eyes or sneezy, that common allergy hay fever type picture. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not reacting to the changes in the environment. So every spring and every fall, I have a certain percentage of my clients flare up, even though their diet's the same, their supplements are the same, their work environment, their home environment, all the same and consistent. The only thing that's changed is the environment. And I don't have it on the screen here, but believe it or not, there are some people that flare up when there's a full moon. We have some people that flare up when the barometric pressure changes. You may have heard kind of the old school, I know that it's going to rain because my knees are hurting because of my rheumatism, my arthritis. Well, the human body has all kinds of different kinds of receptors. Basically our innate intelligence knows how strong the gravitational field is. And so if a full moon has the potential to change the tides of the ocean, which weighs quite a bit more than you do, it can have an impact on your body as well. Now, I'm not saying it will, but if you're finding that you're flaring up and you just can't find the pattern, it may be because the pattern that you're looking for is too short. The cycle length is too short, like what happened today, what happened yesterday. It may be a cyclical variation, whether it's a monthly thing or whether it's a yearly thing in terms of the seasonal changes. So just be watching for those things. The other thing that's a real big deal is going into holiday seasons. I'll tell you from a clinical standpoint that once we hit towards the middle point of November, I start telling most of my clients, particularly the ones that we take on in programs at that period of time, that my goal through the holiday seasons is just to keep them stable and prevent them from regressing. Now, for most people, and I understand this is not true for some, but for most people, the holiday seasons are happy, right? They're seeing family, they're seeing friends, maybe taking some time off work, but happy doesn't mean not stressful, right? Stress can come just from the busyness, from the obligations, from the productivity that has to be put out. And certainly for some people, holidays are emotionally and psychologically just not happy times. Then that can have an impact on people. So holiday seasons can really have an impact on people. Travel is another one, whether it's travel for work or travel in terms of vacation. And again, vacations we usually associate with happiness and relaxation. But how many times have you gone on a vacation and come back exhausted and you say, man, I need a vacation from my vacation? You know, every time my wife and I have taken a vacation with our kids, we've gotten back and said to ourselves, man, we should have tacked on a couple of extra days just to get back into the routine again, just to kind of adjust before we're back to life as usual. Now, what about work? You know, I travel quite a bit on the professional side, the other side of my career, so to speak, which is traveling and lecturing around the country on nutritional medicine or functional medicine. And I enjoy the traveling. I love to teach. I love to lecture. I love to meet docs around the country that are interested in the same things that I am and doing the same things that I do or similar things. But I'll tell you, after a while, it just starts to wear on you. And quite honestly, I don't know how some of these career travelers, whether they're salespeople or just responsible for large territories, whatever, I don't know how they do it all the time. These million milers I run into sometimes in the airports that have literally logged 1 million miles flying from here and there. So whether you're traveling for work or vacation, it can put a big demand on you. And if you're in a situation where you travel on a very regular basis or you vacation on a regular basis, if that's how you've been blessed, then great, but it's going to have a cost. And what that means is that you need to prep ahead and you need to make sure that you're taking supplements with you and doing everything you can so that that work travel or that vacation travel doesn't have an ongoing or a long-term impact on you. But just recognize it can be stressors, or it can be a stressor. The other thing that we don't often think about are modifiable stressors that we just haven't dealt with yet. And I'm going to use a ridiculous example, but sometimes we have what we call toxic people in our lives. They may be family members, they may be old friends, they may be new friends, they may be friends of friends, but they're just toxic in the sense of they're very negative and they just kind of suck the life out of you. And you probably know exactly what I mean. And if you don't have someone like that in your life, great. But sometimes we do. And sometimes we have to get rid of those relationships. And again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I know enough to recognize that certain things can have an impact. And so if you're spending significant amount of time with people that you don't necessarily have to have a relationship with, then stop. And sometimes it takes just someone like me to come along and say, listen, sit down and look at your life and look at every aspect of your life, whether it's your work or your play or whatever, and do an inventory of the things that are sucking the life out of you and causing you distress, and ask one simple question: can I change that? Because there are modifiable stressors in most people's lives that we just haven't dealt with yet. And if we would make that decision and just get up the gumption and the motivation to make that change, to say no in certain circumstances, it can put you in a position to really start to heal quite a bit faster. Remember, part of this discussion is the influence of the mind and your psychology on how your brain gets better. So we're talking about psychoneuroimmunology. And then finally, we have what we call X factor things, or what I call X factor things. I don't think you'll see this term in many other places unless a doctor coming to one of my seminars is starting to use it in their own practice. But basically, X factors are things that we might not have considered yet or tested. And here's a classic example. I have a lot of clients that we work with that have had somewhere in their life an exposure to mold. And some people can handle mold, others can't. Sometimes in the initial consultation in the history, it's obvious that mold is an issue. So we put the testing in to find out. But sometimes it's not quite so obvious because a lot of the symptoms that we see associated with mold toxicity or environmental chemical toxicity or even things like Lyme's disease, they carry over and they overlap with things like thyroid problems and autoimmunities and metabolic syndrome and all the things that we kind of commonly encounter with our average client. So sometimes it's not real obvious that we need to look at it up front, or sometimes we may know that we need to look at certain things, but either the timing's not right or sometimes the finances aren't right. And so we're doing what we're doing for good reason, but there may be some things that we haven't thought about or haven't gotten to yet. And that could be the reason why you're flaring up or maybe not making some progress. So again, it's all part of open dialogue. It's all about making sure that we understand what we've committed to and make sure that we understand what we're going to do with the information we have, but also understanding that we can't test everything. I mean, if we could test everything, and certainly the technology doesn't exist for that, but if we could test everything, then we'd have such an unmanageable job that whatever protocols I could put you on would be completely unmanageable. And there's no way that you could be compliant. So being your own private investigator and looking for these reasons of flare-ups and being aware that sometimes flare-ups and triggers are not quite as obvious as we would want them to be, you got to start doing a little bit of private investigation to figure that out. So what about progress? Progress comes in many different ways, and it's real easy. For example, someone's tired, they're no longer tired. You're not sleeping through the night, now you are. You're, forgive me for the analogy, your bowels weren't working, now they are. These are really, really easy things to find, but sometimes I'll have a conversation with a client, we'll be doing an update, and they'll say, I'll ask them, how are you doing this? Well, nothing's really changed, but we start digging, we start probing, and all of a sudden we start to realize, you know what, based on what you've told me, here's what I'm seeing. And they're like, you know what, you're right. It is better than I thought it was. And part of that is because sometimes we have our eyes on so many different things. I would venture to guess that my average client has about 10 different complaints that we're tracking. And that's just the ones that we're tracking because they seem to be the core problems. So sometimes when it's that big, that picture is that big and that complex, it's very difficult to find where is the progress coming from. But I want to point out that progress can show up in one of three different ways. They can show up in an improvement in frequency of symptoms, meaning I still have it, but I'm not having it quite as frequently. Or I still have it, but it's not as intense. Or I still have it, but when I have it, it doesn't last as long, right? So frequency, intensity, and duration. And you may find that you're starting to show improvement with one of those three things, but not all of them. So for example, I'm just going to use migraine headaches as an example. Let's say that someone's had a migraine or has migraines 2 or 3 times a month, and normally they last 3 or 4 days. Well, they may still, as they're starting to get better, may still have migraines for 2 or 3 times a month, but maybe it's cut down to like a day or a day and a half. We've cut the duration in half. And then once that happens and they get more metabolic stability, we really understand what's triggering it and driving it, then we typically start seeing, hey, it's not 2 or 3 times a month, it's once a month, and instead of a 10 out of 10, it's a 4 out of 10. And so the variables then kind of start to fall like dominoes. But we need to train you to start thinking along the lines of, how am I going to show progress? And is it in an obvious way, or do I have to kind of dig for it and apply my inner Sherlock to this process as well? Sometimes progress is shown not necessarily in an obvious change in frequency, intensity, and duration, but sometimes progress is shown by being able to do more and be more productive without crashing or without paying a price. And that's another very common scenario. We'll say, okay, how are you doing? Well, I'm not doing great. I'm still have the same intensity, the same duration, the same frequency. But you know what? Hey, I cleaned up my attic and, I didn't have to sleep for 3 days afterwards. Or, fill in the blank with whatever analogy works for you. But sometimes it's a little bit sneaky. Sometimes it's hard to recognize. But if you find that you're doing more than you used to without paying the price metabolically, then that's going to be a sign of progress that we're going to latch on to that says, yes, we're on the right track here. So in summary, and this is a relatively short lesson today, but it's a very important one because your mindset really does have a lot to do with the outcome. So the summary is be patient. Be patient and trust the process. Be persistent and learn from your flare-ups. There's always a lesson to be had in there. Show your inner Sherlock, identify and modify or eliminate triggers, and then be aware of the many ways that progress can show up. So thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. This is Dr. N.